Women constitute almost half the world's population, yet they're the least represented when it comes to global politics and politics here in Kenya. In today's conversation, we'll be discussing women in politics, and I'm joined by a very lovely guest that I shall allow her to introduce herself.
Thank you so much. My name is Josephine Cairo. I am both a lawyer and a mediator, and I'm just here to have a sober and objective conversation about what is and what could be and what we might be doing wrong in the middle. So, yes.
Lawyer, mediator, what is and what could be done better. Anyway, just to start us off, we're going to start with a bit of a fact checker for the numbers of politics in women. And one of the things that we realized is that after the 2017 elections, it's the first time in Kenya, women registered the highest number of politicians in parliament. And it is a raise of 29% more from the previous election, which was in 2013. But also a critical observation is we registered 174 parliamentarians who are females, as compared to the total number of seats that was almost 1,883. And also for the first time ever, we also had women being elected as governors and senators, because contrary to what most people are used to, your women are either represented as women representatives, and on a good case scenario, maybe a member of parliament. But for the first time, we were seeing governors and we were seeing senators. So what do you think that reflects when it comes to the day and the times that we're in reference to women in politics?
Well, I genuinely feel like we need to understand the past that we're coming from so that you can appreciate the present and chart a proper future forward in terms of we've come from really far. You cannot compare the times of Jomo Kenyatta and independence and now. There's a huge, huge difference. But at the same time, we need to also be cognizant of the fact that Kenya is largely a very cultural country, and the fact that if we're used to something, we're very alien to change, and we're very alien to, okay, what is this concept that we're not familiar with? So it is something that will take time, and that's why I feel like in as much as there is a deficit, we also need to recognize that there is space for progressive thinking in terms of if we could do that with 40 years, what will another 40 years birth?
But just to echo into something that you've mentioned, is that we've had a long journey coming from the colonial times to the current times that we're in. And just to echo, as I was doing my research for this conversation, there's almost very little history on women in politics post-colonial and pre-colonial times. And it begs me to question of what was the role that women played when it comes to the historical period and the liberation from colonization. And of course, you have your sensationalized Mekatilili Wamenza. And when I say sensationalized, I do not mean that the role she played for the Agiriama uprising was a diminished one. It's that we don't see very many stories as that. And so it got me to thinking, what are some of the journeys or some of the efforts that women in historical times have made? And I came up with a list. It's a very brief list because ideally we could never exhaust that list, even in this conversation. And there's an interesting concept. There's a Field Marshal Muthoni Kilima and the Kipiripiri women. And the role that they were playing, Field Marshal Muthoni was actually an active soldier during the Mau Mau uprising. And you have someone like the Kipiripiri women who used their hairs and very definitive styles to like aid the uprising during the Mau Mau regime. And when you analyze that, someone else would say, but that's a very passive role. And that's why you're not seeing you're not seeing an active uptake for women, even post-colonial era, because as much as women really aided that fight, in Jomo Kenyatta's parliament, we didn't actually see women take positions in politics. And just to ask you a question on that, what do you think was the key contribution to us viewing that journey for women as very passive when it comes to liberation?
Well, I don't think it's actually passive. It is the fact that ideally, however we've been raised, culturally, yes, you can argue that if we can look back at the pre-feminism, yes, women for everything, it was, okay, you are basically a cash cow for the most part, because you will be raised, although I can differ with some tribes like the Maasai, where the person who you loved least is the one who would go for education. If you loved your child the most, they would stay with you literally every single waking day of your life, which isn't really a bad thing because it also depends where people come from. But at the same time, I feel like we had our role, but there is a reason why we are different as gender.
It's not an answer that you can conclusively give, but either way, just to move now into the late 90s, we see an uprising of women that are very progressive, not just academically, but also in terms of the professional careers they take in. And I sampled the likes of Wambui Otieno. Well, media really points a picture of her basically fighting for the rights to bury her husband, but I was following through her journey. She was one of the key people that fought for the ban for colorism in that era of the 1970s. And also you have the likes of Grace Ogot, which we see as the first woman to actually become an MP for Game constituency. So we are moving into a period where we're seeing women who are more educated, and apart from just being educated, really strive to get into the career force for politics. You have the likes of Wangari Maathai, who's a bit more recent, but a very phenomenal conquest, if we can call it that. And then you have the likes of Mary Okello, who ideally is a founder of Makini Skills and the Kenya Women's Finance Trust. So we're seeing a trajectory of women that passively existed or had very passive roles to a generation of women that are coming into politics, and they're coming in big. So now that brings us the question, even as we've made a progressive move for having women that were passively at home to now actively into the political space, why do we still see a slow uptake? What are our setbacks when it comes to that conversation?
I feel like you have actually given me the answer for the previous question in terms of, when we began, I cited the fact that Kenya is ideally a very cultural system where we will proceed how we are used to. And culturally, the lady stays at the house, takes care of everything, and then the man is the person who goes out, does what is required, then comes back. I do not think that the correct term to use is passive. I just feel like that is a norm, because passive says it's negligible and it's not. Yes, because we aided in some bit to smuggle weapons, smuggle foods for the guys at the front. You know, if you have your Grace Ogot, who her publications are the things that we have been our bread and butter from when we were born. It's not really that it's passive. I feel like it's because we just have a very emotive understanding of why aren't we getting what the men are getting? Why aren't we operating at the same scope that we are? Yeah, so I feel like even that boils down to the second question that you asked me in terms of, I don't think it's passive. I think it's the appreciation of generally, although this might go, or this might be the answer in the foregoing questions, the fact that ideally, in an ideal situation, we would be equal. However, that is not the case. And
so it's more of a gradual progression.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just to tackle in the setbacks that women experience when it comes to taking active roles in politics, you see that participation of women in national politics is almost secluded. When we come to passing proposals or ideologies or policies at grassroots levels, women are really encouraged to take up positions at community level. You'll use women to mobilize people to vote. We'll use women to mobilize people to pass for policies that we feel favor us. But when it comes to the national capacity, there's a deliberate exclusion of women from that portfolio. And I'll use a key example that's very recent with us. In the BBI steering committee, we only had 4 women sitting in that steering committee, and the rest were men. A total of 10 men, 4 women. Now, to further boil it down, the chairperson and the secretary were both men. So even the responses that these 4 women would try to bring forward that would cater the woman agenda, if we can call it that, is very periphery. And you don't see it from, I'm not saying that ideally only women can see women's issues, but I feel like they're best positioned to create policies that are centered around women. So why the slow uptake when it comes to national inclusion of women in participation?
Okay, fine. If we can tackle in terms of when the devolution and the devolved government came into place, I think the National Assembly is currently represented with 21.78%, and then the Senate has 30.88%. I do understand the question in terms of why shouldn't there, or in the example for the BBI committee where there are not more women, but also one thing that you need to remember as you're going into this discussion is also capabilities and capacities are a thing. We shouldn't just put women just because, yes, and I'm not saying that there are not enough capable women, but at the same time, what are you going there to do? If I can broach forth, not I guess from the Kenyan sphere, in states there was, I think around 2 years back or so, there was a committee that was convened for deciding the production and the production rate and the all those nitty-gritties for sanitary trials in prisons. And these are female prisons, yet there was an entire bench of only men. Yes, which begs the question of, how long will they decide our issues for us? But at the same time, why weren't there women in that committee? I don't think it's a matter of the fact that they were seen as they should not be there, but it's also as, why are we hesitant to approach these people? Why are we hesitant to
take up active roles, basically?
Yes.
Be actively involved in it.
Yeah.
Well, you raise a very keen concept of capacity. That capacity is very important. Also, not to say that women are not necessarily capable of taking such positions, but also we have to some end, be our own champions, if we can call it like that, take up active roles when it comes to such matters. To bring us back to what are some of the things that the 2010 Constitution has really tried to enhance more numbers of women in parliament. And we have the gender quota, which actively has been implemented in judiciary effectively. We have around 40% of junior court magistrates and around 33% for senior court magistrates. But then we only see gender quota applying fully in the judiciary, and we don't see the same when it comes to civil society and when it comes to the executive. Even to further add, the BBI also, the way it's structured, and this was one of the critics that was highly registered. We see an intentional, or we can call it a deliberate motive, to have special seats created for women in the periphery, like it is mandatory for you to have a deputy governor that's female. But we don't see the same effort being placed when it comes to the executive positions, even things like the majority leader, the seat for the prime minister, and things of that nature. So it again comes to the keen question of, should we focus more on naturally creating opportunities, or should we create opportunities at a mandatory field? Like, where do we cut the edge when it comes to effective policies that actually mean a higher uptake of women in politics?
I think it's a balance of both. Because you see, I personally don't see a problem with the law. Yes, because the Constitution of Kenya, Article 27, Sub-Article 8, is the one that said that there should be a 2/3 gender role. Let us create those platforms, but at the same time, I am of the opinion that we should first see the reason why those platforms are not being filled before making the executive and your judiciary and your legislature actually have the mandatory stance for there must be a woman somewhere, because now that will bring the current issue of the women rep. And I feel like I'll be stoned for this, but I don't really see a necessity of having the women reps in parliament, because if you look at the current ones, what have they done? Yes.
Which brings a very key question of the role that women play in politics.
Yes.
And just to play the devil's advocate, since the uptake of more women in parliament, we've seen a lot of social bills that have passed through parliament. The likes of removing taxes for sanitary towels and diapers, the reproductive bill, and things of that nature, even the Children Act for employment. A lot of bills that were socially centered that before we didn't see them, but I cannot vouch that entirely all those bills were sponsored by women representatives in Kenya. Again, that creates the question of, it's one thing to create political seats for women, and it's another thing to put women that are capable for driving a particular change.
Which boils down to my point again, the problem isn't really the law, the problem is enforcement. If you can compare it with the quota rules of two entirely different countries, ours and Sweden. Because if you look at the Nordic and Slavic countries, they actually also have a quota rule where a certain percentage of parliamentarians or legislation must be female. So we need to ask ourselves, why does New Zealand have a female prime minister? Why are we talking about places that have female presidents? What are we doing wrong? Which now boils down to that question of the fact, I guess, how we started this entire debacle, the fact that women's enemies per se are ourselves community and the politicians, or how the political setup of a country is set. Yes? And unless we tackle those things, we can't, unfortunately, as the matter stands, we can't go further than reproductive bill this, sexual offences bill that, sanitary towels that. We need to understand exactly where the problem is so that we can tackle it effectively.
Yes. Also, somebody else will say that social bills are not necessarily a bad thing, but you also need to see women take up very technical matters, such that we erase that, if I can call it, patriarchal thinking or stereotype that women can only do things that are centered around the home. And just to finish,
I feel like, okay, I'm sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I feel like that's no longer the question. Yes, I genuinely feel like it's not a question of capacity and capabilities. Case in point, one of, or if I can say two of the most prominent issues that face us politically is one, lack of financing. Because if you look at it properly, we don't have the capacities to get these guys like the Jim Wanjigis, the Jim Nambaris to actually finance us. Notwithstanding even political parties, they will go for where they can endear themselves most to the public. If they see that a woman is not meeting the bill, then they won't take up a female candidate. And that is okay, because everyone has their own self-interest. It shouldn't just boil down to, okay, we're women, we have not yet been seen enough. Because unfortunately how it is that the feminism discussion is now becoming a bit redundant. Again, please do not stone me for this, but it's because we have advocated for this thing for the past 2 decades to the extent where now the boy child is being forgotten. So now that we are getting into spaces of power that we aren't used to, into executive offices, you're seeing CFOs, CEOs, all of us are women. Slowly and gradually, where does that now leave us in terms of how we're building our communities? Will we be there in terms of relevance, or will we be there just to fill a seat and say, okay, I'm a woman, I made it, but will you have enough merit to justify the fact that you are there? Because this entire biashara of saying, okay, fine, we have seats now, let us go for them, by virtue of the fact that you're women, that should not be the case. What do you have to bring aside from your gender?
Aside from your gender, yeah. Very, very interesting sentiments there. Just as to wrap us off, you bring a key concept of capabilities and being able to execute your position in power. But they say women were not our biggest supporters.
Yes.
Even in the case that we get women that are actually capable of executing these positions of leadership and things of that nature, women still don't vote for other women when it comes to such matters.
Sure.
We only vote for them when they're women reps, but we don't vote for them
if they're running for
presidency. If they're running for presidency or if they're running for top seats. And what do you think can tackle that mentality?
I feel like it's not just an issue of women not voting for women. It's the same thing as, what reason would you as Jane give me to vote for you? Yes, it's not just a matter of, I have arrived at the executive body, I'm the one who's vying for these offices, but what will I do when I get there? Do you have enough personality and enough charisma to convince me to vote for you? Because you standing for office and me wanting you to stand for office are two entirely different things. Two entirely
different things.
Yes.
Yes, it boils down to the concept of numbers. Personally, ideally, I'm a numbers person. So if I would consider voting for someone for any seat, I need to see a profitability of such a move. I'm not necessarily inclined to just want to vote because you're a woman. Anyway, thank you so much for having this discussion with us. Just to throw it out to our audience, if you have very diverse concepts or interesting comments that you want to make when it comes to our conversation of women in politics, feel free to drop us a comment in the comment section. And until next time, it's goodbye from us.